Hi folks, Lou here, and I'm going to talk at some length about why I don't play many new tabletop games and why new games are most unlikely to be better than many existing ones. So, I almost never play a newly published game. If I play any game, it's usually one that has been around a long time and whose quality is well known and what I've probably played before. Why is that? Well, first of all, I don't have any of the cult of the new in me. Not for games or for anything else. There are some cases where new is usually better, as in technology. But sometimes the new is unlikely to be as good as some of the older. And keep in mind, when we're talking about games, I'm talking about the quality of the play, not the looks, not the bits, not the plastic figures and so on. How well does the game actually play? I like to play really good games many times rather than play lots of games a few times. And if I do, my experience overall is likely to be better that way. I miss out on many duds, for example, and believe me, most new tabletop and video games are duds from my point of view. So why is a new game unlikely to be better? Well, I don't think that design techniques have advanced so much or so rapidly that new is likely to be an improvement, unlike with televisions or other technology. Changes in tabletop games have come more from changes in preferences than improvement in techniques. Older games have often used techniques that are now touted as new, but are not. They're just commonly used now, where they were not in the past. Also, new games are usually abstract, not models, and I much prefer models of some reality. Now let's think about probabilities. Think of the universe of old games and of new games as two Gaussian curves, also known as normal or bell curves, and I'll show you one with the next slide. At the left are the poorest games, at the right the best, and there aren't very many of them. The very worst and best are at the extreme ends, that's really where there's not very many, and in the middle is a great mass of average-ish games. The old games curve includes many, many thousands of games. The new games curve is much smaller, however many you want to count as new games. Now this is a Gaussian curve, and you see the shape. That's why it's called a bell curve. I don't know why it's called a normal curve. And that's what I'm talking about. Now, a game that's near the upper end, on the right, of all old games in quality is very likely to be much better than a new game that is near the upper end of the new game quality. This is simple math. It's because of numbers. And of course, over time, we find out which are the really good games and which are not. There are lots of games that come out and people say, oh, this is a great game. And a year later, well, they don't think it's such a great game anymore. Now, it's simple math unless you assume, and again, I think it's false to assume this, that new games are somehow much better designed. But I've never subscribed to the cult of the new, and many people nowadays do. That's why when a company issues a new product, whether it's food or something else, they tout how much it's new, even if they really haven't done much to change it, because they think that will persuade people to buy it. I also think that many new games are made to lower standards than in the past. Now, of course, we can point out that many new games, most new games, are self-published, which eliminates curation, which is not quite the same as editing, but when you have a curator, for example, a publisher who accepts or does not accept the game, they have the opportunity to decide how it could be improved or to decide it's not good enough. And without this curation, there's a higher proportion of crap. The people who do support Kickstarter games mostly don't have a clue. They're buying them more for the bits and how it looks and so on than about the gameplay. because they don't know how it plays, because it's brand new. I think also that the standard for games nowadays is good for 1 to 3 plays, where in the past it was good for many, many plays. It's kind of like jokes. John Steinbeck, I think, said, or maybe it was Robert Heinlein, good once, good twice, or always good. And games can be that way too. But the game standard now is good, maybe, once or twice, not always good. Now, some of them are always good, but that's the exception rather than the rule. It's good enough for them to be good for a couple of plays for people who want to explore the game and not master it, and then they move on to the next game. I'm also not a jaded gamer who needs new mechanisms to maintain interest. And often those aren't actually new mechanisms, they're just mechanisms unfamiliar to most players. And as I've said, I prefer models to abstractions, yet so many new games are essentially abstract with a so-called theme tacked on. This is never satisfying to me. I want what happens in the game to correspond to some reality. Also, in my mind, abstracts should be simple, not complex. But as most abstracts are also puzzles, many are made to be complex to make the puzzle harder to solve. Now, unfortunately, I despise puzzles. And yet games with multiple paths to victory are in fact puzzles with several solutions. A good game, should not have a solution or several solutions. That's not how it's supposed to work. But puzzles, yes. I have another reason not to play, which is related to designer Reiner Knizia, who's had vast numbers of games published. And he is said to only play his own games because he wants to make his own solutions to design problems, not use those of others. And I agree with that. Now, I have to say I'm not actually averse to borrowing from other games when it makes sense. I just rarely seem to do it. Now, I'm going to quote a couple of tweets which show my attitude more or less. The first one is from @FactoryGames. I don't know who this is. Quote, I get it. It's cute when someone is new to the gaming hobby and excitedly posts about how many games they are buying. But listen to me. You eventually get to the point where you realize that every game you buy is just keeping you from playing the games you really love. Unquote. Every game you buy is just keeping you from playing the games you really love. The second quote is from Stephen Glenn, who is a game designer and in fact won the German Game of the Year prize quite a few years ago for a game called Balloon Cup, I believe. Quote, truth. Advancing age has encouraged me to pinpoint the few dozen games in my collection that make me happy. I check that list every time I consider buying a new game and ask myself, is this new thing worth the time it will subtract from my favorites? Unquote. That's Stephen Glenn. Those are part and parcel of my attitude. Now, obviously, your mileage may vary. You may have a very different point of view. I'm not saying this is how you should think. It's just explaining how I think and how I behave. Thanks for listening.